So China may have termed the report that it probed weaponizing the coronavirus in 2015 as an outright lie. But there has been so much of an evidence that has been piling up since the outbreak of the pandemic. And we at Republic TV have been reporting every development on it. James Kraska is joining us on the broadcast now. James Kraska is the chairman, and Charles Stockton, Professor of International Maritime Law. James, good evening, and thank you for speaking to Republic TV. First of all, the developments in the last few days, been reading some reports in the American media as well of the funding to the Wuhan lab as more and more questions are being raised. Different reports, one of independent experts looking into the World Health Organization's role itself on handling the pandemic, and a 2015 report that talks about how coronaviruses were being developed for possible biowarfare.
Thank you very much, Naranjan. Very pleased to be able to talk to you and Republic TV and all of your viewers today. It's a really compelling question. In the United States, there appears to be evidence that the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Allergy, Infectious Disease did fund research that contributed to this gain of function line of research in Wuhan at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And this is now a big question that Congress is looking into to the extent of US involvement, and also what was going on in China at the time, because as you mentioned, China has not been transparent on their efforts to look at so-called gain of function research on COVID viruses.
Yeah. Now, but you mentioned how there is intense focus in the Congress about possible US funding, and I'm just reading from reports, James, reports of how Dr. Fauci, for one, who was asked a few questions, and he's gone on record to say that they have never funded any such research, any gain of function research. We have him on record. We also have a quote. In fact, we saw some of the questioning from senators to Dr. Fauci, and he seems to be very confident that, I'm reading one of his quotes where he said that there was absolutely no funding, and that they didn't fund the gain of function research.
Yeah, so I think this is still an open question. There are credible news reports that have a different story. I would encourage people to look at a long article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that's online, May 5th of 2021, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. That's by a respected science writer from the New York Times who talks about how the National Institute of Health funded such research from 2014 to 2019. And from the congressional sessions that you mentioned, there appears to be some differences in semantics, whether those studies were conducted in the United States by Chinese scientists or actually conducted in Wuhan. And so I think right now we're still in the investigative stage. There's also other evidence, including from the Washington Post, that suggests that there was some US funding for it. But that doesn't obviate the need for investigation in Wuhan in particular, that has the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has a biosafety level of number 4, the highest level, which it achieved in 2015. And Wuhan also has a Center for Disease Control that has a biosafety level of only level 2, which is quite significantly lower. And apparently there may have been coronavirus research done there. And so one of these two institutes in Wuhan appears to be the most likely origin for the coronavirus.
Yeah, and that was one of the articles that I was referring to, because, across India, it's one of the biggest talking points. That's Nicholas Wade's article. He's a very respected science writer, and he says that, and he describes a key Chinese researcher whose work received support from Dr. Fauci's institute via a US group called EcoHealth. There's been so much of an intense focus on not just the article, but but the circumstances. Now, he writes, and I quote, "As many people know, there are two theories about the origin. One is that it jumped naturally from wildlife to people. The other is that the virus was under study in a lab from which it escaped. It seems to me that proponents of the lab escape can explain all the available facts about SARS-2 considerably more easily than can those who favor natural emergence." Now, if there has been so much of evidence since last year, do you feel, James, that there has been intense lobbying, perhaps pressure, perhaps from China to cover up the truth in this case?
Of course, there always is on everything with China, whether it's cyber attacks, trade relations, foreign policy, economic policy, conditions within China. The Communist Party of China runs a massive disinformation apparatus to try to advance the objectives of the Communist Party of China. China also employs soft power more effectively than probably any nation on earth in pressuring and coercing governments and private media to go lightly on China and to not dig too deeply in something that may embarrass the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. And then the reason I say that is because we know firsthand through experience how the Chinese try to make inroads into your media to try and somehow influence you. For example, there was an article I was reading of how global media houses were approached by Chinese state media agencies for free content, for one. Just an example of how perhaps their influence runs deep, much deeper, many would argue, than the Americans did.
Absolutely. It's one of their major forms of influence throughout the world is either coercion or using all elements, including in the West in particular. China weaponizes the past, the colonial legacy in a way that no other country has, to trade on guilt and the century of humiliation and try to develop the sense that the rest of the world owes China something and should be particularly lenient on China. Of course, this is evident in everything from global trade to foreign policy, and now, of course, with the coronavirus. The most likely explanation is that the COVID virus did arise from one of these institutes in China. This was first reported in the Washington Post on April 14th of 2020, when there were US State Department cables from 2 years prior to that in 2018 that reported that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a massive safety risk, that it had risks in safety and mismanagement, that they were conducting COVID bat virus research, and that there was a potential for a catastrophic human pandemic. This was reported just in April 14th of last year, of 2020, these State Department cables. And yet the US government and other governments have not really investigated these or gotten cooperation from China.
There is a sense across the world that China is legally responsible for COVID-19 damage and they should pay. And that's been the overwhelming view. And for some reason, nobody's been able to hold China or Beijing to account. The WHO was given the task, failed miserably at it. And the WHO found and tasked another independent body which also has failed to hold the WHO responsible for not being able to hold China responsible, isn't it?
Yes, it's definitely the case. And it's very difficult to hold a country responsible and then to receive appropriate reparations. And what are the reparations for 3 million people dead, countless people that have been sick, and massive strikes against the global economy? The amounts would be almost unimaginable. And yet there's a difficulty in trying to move that conversation forward, even though it's a conversation that needs to be had politely and respectfully among governments and between the world community and China. China's lawful responsibility for their internationally wrongful acts. Even if the COVID virus release was accidental, which is probably the case, then nonetheless, China is responsible for its disinformation and lack of transparency that has exacerbated the conditions.
And legally, where do we stand now in the battle to hold countries responsible? Do you think if it indeed it was a lab leak, do you think eventually China can be still held responsible?
Well, Niranjan, unfortunately, in international law, states have the protection of sovereign immunity. So it's very difficult to hold a country accountable in a collective venue or a collective process. My view would be that this is ultimately a political problem and that like-minded states have to work together in order to impose costs on China for their malign behavior. For example, when the virus was first discovered in Wuhan, you're probably familiar that China blocked flights from Wuhan to Shanghai and Beijing, yet it let flights continue to go throughout the world, seeding the world with coronavirus.
Okay, if I can take that point forward, because you've extensively documented that in one of your articles in 2020. The evidence, at least the circumstantial evidence against China, has been massive and documented, across the world, and you've documented it. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about what we know and how much of evidence is actually available that point fingers at China's role, perhaps?
Well, the theory of Occam's razor suggests that the most obvious explanation is probably the correct explanation. And there's essentially no evidence to link the coronavirus to a natural outbreak. And yet there's a lot of evidence, some of that we talked about here, Niranjan, that suggests that this came from one of those laboratories in Wuhan. Furthermore, China has not been transparent. They have destroyed samples or failed to produce samples as they are required to do to the World Health Organization. They did not make proper notifications to the World Health Organization. And so the World Health Organization, it was concluded by former Secretary of State Pompeo that it had been corrupted, that it was politicized. And that led to the United States withdrawal, and then the new administration had second thoughts and believes that it's better to try to transform the WHO from inside the organization. China has also proposed a number of very dubious theories about the origin of the COVID virus without any evidence whatsoever, blaming other countries to try to deflect responsibility rather than to cooperate with the global community in order to get to the origin and prevent this from happening again.
Yeah. So much to talk about and so much more to unravel. James, thank you for speaking to Republic TV. We will keep connecting with you as and when there's a development on this front.
Thank you, Niranjan. Have a great night.
You too.